Welcome to the Hyperpod. Today we have Brad from the Hyperliquid Policy Center with us. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's really great to be on. We're always looking for chances to engage with the Hyperliquid ecosystem more. So very happy to be here and talk about HPC and the work we're doing here on the US regulatory front.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you guys on. I know there's been a lot going on behind the scenes, and we're sort of seeing the announcements on Twitter and spamming Hyperliquid in the comments just because we're excited, but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to get to that point. So yeah, that's really what we want to discuss today and find that alpha from you guys. So before we start, maybe tell us a bit more about how HPC was established. Was it your idea? Was it Jeff's idea? How did it start?
Yeah, definitely. So we are the Hyperliquid Policy Center. We launched back in February of this year. And we are a nonprofit advocacy and research organization based in Washington, D.C. On the backstory, I think that we're headed up by our CEO, Jake Chervinsky, who has been very active kind of in the crypto DeFi policy space for quite a while now. And I know he and Jeff connected last year and kind of got to talking about the idea of having kind of a dedicated policy center here in the US, kind of to be the voice of the Hyperliquid ecosystem and really kind of be in the mix from the policy scene, looking to move markets on chain and to be a constant voice here in the US in DC. So our work is focused on advancing new rules and new regulations that allow Americans to access on-chain markets with an emphasis, on on-chain derivatives markets like we have on Hyperliquid.
Amazing. And is the HPC, how does it relate to Hyperliquid itself? Is it just seen as some organization that's contributing to the network, or what is its role specifically?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, we're definitely our own independent organization based here in the US. We very much see ourselves as community aligned, looking out for the interests of the entire ecosystem. We're funded by the Hyper Foundation originally with a grant from them. And so that's been instrumental in standing us up and allowing us to do our work. We certainly aren't here, as part of the core team, but we are very much in discussions with them. We talk with them. We talk with several other companies in the ecosystem. If you're out there building on Hyperliquid and you haven't had a chance to connect with us, I would encourage you definitely to reach out. We're always looking for ways to be additive to the ecosystem and to really be here and to be a voice for anybody building on Hyperliquid.
Yeah, amazing. You guys have done an awesome job already engaging with a number of different teams. So, in the past week or two, we've had really big rulings, obviously from the CFTC, and then at the same time, a lot of stuff happening on the Clarity Act. So maybe walk us through what do each of these mean? And secondly, how do they actually relate to each other, in terms of how it affects Hyperliquid?
Yeah, so last week was really big in the United States for bringing perps to the U.S. market. The CFTC took 4 different actions. I think it would be helpful to kind of give a high level overview of each of those because they kind of vary in terms of the scope and who they apply to. So I think it's really helpful to kind of level set and talk about what it means for the perps markets here in the U.S. What it could mean for Hyperliquid. So definitely happy to start there. So I think the first big action we saw, which was something that we were expecting when it comes to perps, and the CFTC has been interested in perps for a while now. They issued a request for comment around this time last year, asking lots of questions about how perps should be categorized from a regulatory perspective, kind of what the key issues are for venues where perps are traded. What market participants need to think about when engaging with these products. And so, the industry submitted comments and feedback, and kind of after a year of reviewing those comments, it culminated in the actions we saw last week. So the first one was an order from the commission to Kalshi, which allows the listing of Bitcoin perpetuals as futures contracts here in the United States. And this was a really big deal because in the last administration here in the US, there was really a lot of regulatory uncertainty about how perps should be treated from a regulatory standpoint. And primarily the question being, whether they can be listed as futures contracts or whether they would be treated as swaps. And that's a really important point because everything in the US regulatory regime for derivatives kind of flows downhill from that product categorization issue. And there was kind of a mixed record in the enforcement history. We had seen in actions with BitMEX and Binance, the CFTC took the position that perps were swaps. And then, we had seen similar actions from the SEC in the Mango Markets context with Avraham Eisenberg, where they referred to them as futures. And so this was kind of a big open question for the industry. And so what Kalshi did is, as a US regulated designated contract market, which is really just a fancy term for a derivatives exchange, there are two ways that they can list new products. And so one way is through what's called self-certification. And so you basically file with the CFTC and say, hey, we're going to list this new contract. We're going to certify it complies with all of the applicable regulatory obligations. And then those contracts can go live after a one-day waiting period. The other path you can take as a DCM is doing what's called a voluntary product approval. And that's where you go to the CFTC beforehand and you kind of give them a sense of, here's the product we want to list. Here's kind of our analysis of the product type. Here's why we think it complies. Would you please kind of sign off on this product and allow us to list it? And that's not a process that's really used quite a bit for various commercial reasons. I think the last time it was used was actually about 10 years ago, following Dodd-Frank. But so that's the path that Kalshi took with their perpetual futures offering, where they submitted this form to the CFTC. They did the analysis. They said that we think these are futures contracts, and here's how we propose to list them. And so the CFTC reviewed that filing, and they agreed with Kalshi that these could be listed as futures contracts. They did kind of dive into the mechanics a bit about what exactly the asset type looked like. And I'll get to that in a second. But kind of the takeaway here was that the CFTC agreed with them and allowed them to proceed with listing Bitcoin perpetuals. As part of that order too, the CFTC went a bit further and said that this is about the Bitcoin and Bitcoin spot markets. We think that they're deeply liquid, they have broad distribution, they're actively traded. And these were all important features of the Bitcoin spot markets that the CFTC found to be sufficient to list perpetual contracts on. And so they also said that for other digital commodities, which is the term the SEC and the CFTC use to refer to digital assets that are not securities, that the logic of this order would also extend to other digital assets that share those spot market characteristics. And so under that order Kalshi received, they were permitted to list these Bitcoin perpetuals, and then shortly thereafter went back through the self-certification process and self-certified, I think it was around 12 other contracts that were also on digital assets for trading. And so
so in that scenario, Kalshi is basically going to the CFTC and saying, hey guys, we want to list X, Y, and Z. We believe that these are liquid enough based on the following reasons. The CFTC basically looks at that and says, yes, you're good to go. And then trading can begin. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the general order of operations. And so that order for Kalshi is unique to them. It applies to their product types. But then what the CFTC also did was they released a policy statement, which is a form of non-binding guidance. So it doesn't create legal rights or obligations for any market participants, but it kind of gives them a roadmap forward on how to proceed on a particular issue. And so here, what the policy statement said is that if you are also a DCM in the United States and you're looking to list perpetuals, you can proceed under the self-certification framework when we're talking about the Bitcoin perpetuals, when we're talking about the other kinds of digital asset perps that have the spot market characteristics that they identified as the Bitcoin spot market's having. For those types of contracts, other DCMs can proceed under the self-certification pathway. But then they said, if you're looking to list a perp on any other kind of commodity, whether it be oil or gas or metals, for those types of contracts, they're guiding participants to come back in and go through the voluntary approval process so that they can, demonstrate why they think that the spot market conditions are sufficient to list a perp on.
Makes sense. So how does this differ to, the pathway Coinbase took where, they're effectively, US regulated FCM and they're connecting US customers through a foreign futures and options broker. So that looks quite different to Kalshi. And what's your thoughts on that? Like, why did they take that pathway? And what's the reasons for it?
Yeah, I think the no action relief that Coinbase got is really interesting. So kind of the first part of it is that it kind of takes the same reasoning from the Kalshi order as it pertains to the actual perpetual contracts, and looks at the contracts that are available on Deribit and says that it's okay for Coinbase to treat those as foreign futures. And the reason that that's relevant is because there is a framework under the CEA where foreign exchanges, which are referred to as foreign boards of trade, can provide access to US market participants. And so the way that works, though, is if you are an FBOT that provides direct access to US market participants, you have to come in and register with the CFTC as a registered FBOT. And that comes with a number of regulatory requirements, including consenting to the CFTC's jurisdiction, and complying with various obligations that are similar to those that apply to US regulated exchanges. What's unique about this order is that because you have the introduction of an offshore intermediary, a foreign future and options broker, there's no direct access between the FBOT and the US market participants. And so the foreign exchange, which is Deribit in this case, is not also required to come register with the CFTC. But Deribit itself is a Dubai regulated exchange. It's licensed, I believe, as a virtual asset service provider. And so kind of the takeaway here is that Coinbase was able to get no action relief to have this US access chain where US market participants can go through the US regulated FCM, which in turn can post collateral to the foreign broker, which can then go to Deribit directly.
Makes sense. So do you think Coinbase has a specific reason for going this route versus Kalshi? Because from the outside, it seems like, okay, Coinbase is regulated, Kalshi is regulated. It seems like Kalshi's route is better. It seems more rock solid. And then, from the outside, it looks like Coinbase is bringing in Deribit for no apparent reason from what we can see.
Yeah, without having been, privy to the actual commercial conversations there, I think that one advantage is that when it comes to digital asset derivatives, I think we've seen some foreign jurisdictions kind of take a more progressive view towards how to list those. So Deribit, for example, has had various options in futures and perps products live for quite a while now, kind of under a more developed international regulatory framework. And so I would imagine there's a bit of operational simplicity from Coinbase's side of kind of having an exchange that's already stood up these products that they can now provide US access to.
Got you. And am I correct in saying that US customers on Coinbase that would be trading these products are effectively tapping into the liquidity that exists on Deribit? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And the other piece of the Coinbase no action order that was pretty unique is the way that it allows them to take stablecoin and digital asset collateral and actually move that directly from the FCM to the offshore broker to Deribit. And there's a custody element involved as well with Coinbase's trust company. But I think it's kind of a low friction way that US users who already own stable coins can really now engage kind of in derivatives trading on an offshore venue without the need to go through, fiat conversion and whatnot.
Yeah, and so in this scenario, the US customers of Coinbase are actually trading with Deribit users, even if the Deribit users are sitting in some other country, right?
Right.
Okay, so would I be correct in saying that this could be a viable path for Hyperliquid? Obviously, there's like a lot of other stuff that needs to happen, but this basically is a first signal to say, here's a US regulated entity that is trading or using the liquidity on an offshore exchange, and also trading with the users on that offshore exchange, even though that offshore exchange may not be regulated in the US. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a very positive development, and it kind of shows, what the CFTC has been saying publicly about wanting to, onshore these markets that have grown to prominence offshore. One caveat I would add is that typically what you see with no action letters is they are unique to the company that acquired them, subject to the conditions that are laid out in there. But oftentimes what you'll see in kind of more in simpler no action letters is other market participants starting to conform their activities around the conditions in the no action letter so that they can kind of, benefit, and get some legal comfort there, even if it's not directed towards them. What's different in my view about the Coinbase no action letter in some respects is that the conditions are pretty robust, and the framework that Coinbase has gotten is one in which every company that's involved is a subsidiary of some form of Coinbase Global, which is a US publicly traded company. So I do think it'll be more difficult for other market participants to do this exact structure in the way that Coinbase has done it, kind of without that infrastructure and apparatus in place already. But I do think it is promising in the sense of the CFTC, pursuing innovative ways to bring the offshore markets here onshore.
Yeah, makes sense. So, based on your discussions that you guys have had in Washington and with some of the regulators, what's their current viewpoint on a decentralized platform like Hyperliquid? Is it something completely new to them? Do they look at perps as, okay, there's perps that are being traded on centralized venues offshore? That's category one. And then there's this sort of new category, perps being traded on a decentralized venue like Hyperliquid, and that's sort of something else that they still need to get to. Like where does it rank in terms of their understanding and their priority right now?
Yeah, it's definitely on the radar. We've been having many conversations. A lot of our work is educational, kind of talking about Hyperliquid and the benefits of the on-chain infrastructure. To that point, I think that seeing the guidance that came out being limited to centralized US exchanges was totally expected. I think there's a bit of a crawl, walk, run approach when it comes to getting to on-chain markets. And that kind of getting legal clarity on the centralized exchange piece is an important first step, so that then we can start having more in-depth conversations about what it looks like to have perps traded on on-chain infrastructures.
Is one of their focuses and priorities around like the transparency of those markets? Is that like a big weighting factor for them to say, hey, this is okay or this is not? Would you say that's the case?
It's certainly a boon, and it's definitely a tool that's in our arsenal to be able to point to the natural transparency and auditability you get in on-chain infrastructures. It really can bring a lot of great benefits to the market. One of the biggest products that many centralized exchanges offer, is this gated access to order book data and the like, which when we're talking about Hyperliquid is all data that's freely available on chain. And I think it certainly goes a long way kind of in our conversations about, extolling the virtues of moving to fully transparent on-chain infrastructures. And it's definitely a point that we'll continue to make and kind of, preach the benefits of these open, transparent systems like we have with Hyperliquid.
For Hyperliquid to enter the US regulated space, who actually goes through the approval process? Would it be the Hyperliquid Foundation? Would it be the Hyperliquid team? Do they set up a US entity and then self-certify as a DCM? What does that actually look like in the practical sense?
Yeah, I think these are all good questions and difficult ones that we're continuing to think through on our end as well. So I don't have a definitive answer there, but I think it's helpful to kind of understand, the U.S. registrant framework, and how users can access the market. And so, we have, U.S. retail users who, by virtue of the Commodity Exchange Act and the CFTC's regulatory framework, are required to trade futures on an exchange, which, as we talked about earlier, is the designated contract market. And typically in U.S. markets, they access a DCM through what's called a futures commission merchant, which is really just like a broker in the securities context. And then ultimately trades are settled and cleared through a derivatives clearing organization, which steps in, as the counterparty and effectively becomes the buyer to every seller and the seller to every buyer. And so one of the things we're thinking through is kind of, how does that framework map on to the tech stack like we have with Hyperliquid, where you've got Hypercore, which is where a lot of the matching function is happening and where we've got kind of the clearing and settlement functions happening. You've got interfaces, which are kind of the access point, not the exclusive access point, but one of the access points that are most popular. You kind of have an ecosystem of wallet providers and third-party interface providers. And so a lot of our work is dedicated to thinking through kind of how to natively solve for a lot of the regulatory objectives of this infrastructure when it comes to, market integrity and settlement integrity and customer funds protection, which in a lot of ways, the animating regulatory concerns can be natively solved for through self-custodial on-chain infrastructure. And so I know it's not a direct answer to what it looks like, but I think that, we're still giving a lot of thought to, where the functions of an on-chain ecosystem best map onto and kind of what the path forward can look like in a way where, we can have US access to Hyperliquid's markets kind of in a way that meets the core regulatory objectives animating the Commodity Exchange Act.
Yeah, totally get that and respect that there's only a certain amount of stuff you can say. You touched on builder codes there. So, builder codes is one of the main ways that a lot of people actually experience or touch Hyperliquid these days, whether it's like through Phantom or, through some other like builder code front end. Do you think that is, potentially a viable option to propagate Hyperliquid as a source of liquidity into the US? But I guess based on our conversation, it would again have to happen through these regulated players that are, effectively using the same model as Coinbase, right?
Yeah, the builder codes I think are a really unique innovation that's come out of Hyperliquid in the way that various different participants can really just plug into the liquidity right away. I think that there's a lot of promising signs we've seen. Phantom, for example, which is one of the biggest builder code integrators. They recently received no action relief from the CFTC. That's not directly applicable to Hyperliquid, but it does kind of provide at least a roadmap for what you can have in a front end interface, kind of providing access to regulated products like derivatives. And so under their no action, they're able to route directly to DCMs. They're able to partner with FCMs to provide access to regulated products. So I think it's an important first building block to get to a place where you can plug in something like Hyperliquid after that from a US regulatory standpoint in a way that US users can use and access it. But it's certainly very promising. But to your point, it's not as easy as just kind of doing the technical integration, which I'm aware is also not an easy feat in itself. There still kind of needs to be the supportive regulatory framework behind it, so that U.S. Integrators of builder codes can feel comfortable, from a regulatory standpoint, in providing direct access to the hyperliquid markets. So that's certainly part of our work. I think it goes part and parcel with our broader policy initiatives, and seeking to get clarity about how we can move derivatives markets on chain here in the U.S. And that builder codes, will be a great way to leverage that in the future. Kind of once that framework is clearer.
Yeah. So we've had HIP3 grow a lot. So that's mainly been through Unit or the TradeXYZ team. And so far the discussion here has been around like digital commodities, but what about equity perps or index perps? We saw that there was this license between the S&P 500 to have the first official perp being traded via TradeXYZ on Hyperliquid. Is this a whole different animal, for the CFTC to look at? Like in the order of priority, is it like CFTC looks at digital commodities, i.e. crypto, and then equity perps and indices perps, etc.?
Yeah, I certainly think it's a building block approach, with the guidance that the CFTC put out being limited to digital asset perps. And I think it's worth understanding a little bit more about why it was limited in that way to begin with. So one of the things that a DCM must ensure when it lists a contract is that the contract itself is, quote, not readily susceptible to manipulation. And I think this factors into how much real estate the CFTC's order gave to really taking a look at the Bitcoin spot markets. And so just as a reminder, kind of the factors they looked at were whether there were deep spot market liquidity, whether the asset was traded on multiple venues, whether there was active trading volume, and really an ability to kind of continuously observe the price. And the reason that this is so relevant when we're talking about perps is because when you look at something like a dated future that has kind of like a settlement reference or a settlement index, the point the CFTC made was that really like the index and the settlement reference that you're looking at really has to only be reliable at one fixed point in time, which is at the expiry of the contract, versus when you start to look at a perp where you have much more frequent funding rate payments going back and forth. You really need that settlement reference to be reliable and robust all the time, as opposed to this one fixed point in time. And so with digital assets, which natively have 24/7 spot markets, it's much easier to kind of observe what's going on in the spot market and to have liquidity there on an ongoing basis. And one of the things that I think they're going to be looking for when we start talking about perps on other types of assets is how you can ensure the integrity of the oracle and the settlement reference on this ongoing basis in markets that might not trade 24/7 natively, which gets into kind of the equity perps discussion when we don't yet have fully 24/7 trading for equities. There's not fully 24/7 trading for other types of commodities like agricultural and energy commodities. And so I do think it's going to be kind of the next phase of the evolution of perps in the US is looking at the various commodity types and other equities and seeing how to build like robust settlement indexes that can be leveraged in a perp. And kind of more directly on the equities piece, the way that the derivatives laws here kind of allocate jurisdiction is when you're looking at a broad-based equity index, so something like the S&P 500. If that is, those are generally going to fall within the CFTC's regulatory ambit. And then when you start moving into single securities, those are either going to be under joint jurisdiction if they're treated as security futures with the CFTC and the SEC, or if they're treated as security-based swaps something that's going to fall into the SEC's jurisdiction. And so the CFTC noted that when we start thinking ahead to equity perps, these are going to be conversations that are going to happen between the agencies. But I think that there's a very optimistic framework for them to collaborate on these topics under the memorandum of understanding that they signed earlier this year, where one of the express purposes of that was to facilitate, access to novel derivative types here in the U.S. So I think it's optimistic going forward. It's just going to have to take coordination between the agencies to settle on a framework that makes sense.
Yeah, so we got some news also in the past few weeks around like the CME and some other competitors effectively, from what we've heard, lobbying against perps or a Hyperliquid style venue. What are you able to share like from behind the scenes on what's that actually all about? Is that incumbents that are legitimately scared/worried about Hyperliquid and this type of technology disrupting their business? And yeah, what's your sense on that?
Yeah, I think we're at a point in time where we're seeing a lot of innovation, not just in terms of product types, but in market structure, which is definitely something that can be disruptive. And you do get a lot of kind of the traditional incumbent concerns around market share and product types. So I think that we're obviously very pro innovation. I think that our regulatory framework here in the U.S. is very conducive to innovation. And one of the express purposes of the CEA and of the CFTC's mandate is to consider how to implement the derivatives and commodities laws in a way that promotes competition. And so I do think that there is going to be a competitive landscape going forward, not just between centralized exchanges with different competing product types, kind of like we're seeing with the emergence of the prediction markets venues that have been faster to move, on listing all types of event contracts than some of the legacy exchanges, but then also the added competition of looking at on-chain versus off-chain markets. And I think we do want to get to a world where everybody here, whether on-chain or off-chain, is able to compete kind of under a regulatory framework that doesn't advantage legacy institutions. It doesn't advantage newer upstarts. Like I really think that an ideal outcome is a level playing field where if the legacy exchanges want to innovate on blockchains, like that's fantastic and that's great, and they can unlock the efficiencies that can be had by moving markets on chain, kind of on a level playing field. But I think it's going to be really important as part of our work just to ensure that we can get to that place where the markets can really compete, and we can let the market decide.
Yeah, 100%. Totally agree. I mean, this would be the best outcome for the US, and of course, best outcome for Hyperliquid if we can get to that point. So, as you know, we have a very passionate community. All of us are super loud on Twitter and on a number of different social channels. So, we're not in Washington, but we'd love to know how we can help. In our previous discussions, you mentioned making noise on Twitter actually does move the needle. So tell us a bit more about what can we do, where can we help you guys, where can we apply some public pressure to try and move this ahead.
Yeah, we absolutely love the .hl community that is on X and on Twitter. We see everybody in their replies whenever we post something, and we love it. I'll just add that kind of crypto Twitter in DC does have a very special place kind of in the regulatory discussion. And when it comes to things like the Clarity Act and various things that the agencies are doing, like these are certainly things that policymakers are reading. We try to be very supportive whenever they're being pro innovation and kind of moving the ball forward. So to the extent that the Hyperliquid ecosystem wants to leverage their voice on social media, we certainly love that, and we always look out for it. Aside from that, there is a lot of work the agencies are doing, both in the form of rulemaking, and then there's a lot of work on Capitol Hill around the Clarity Act. And there are others kind of in the crypto policy ecosystem that we work closely with, the DeFi Education Fund being one, the Blockchain Association, CCI, a lot of these great organizations that are here on behalf of the industry. So any work that you see that they're doing out there, would say please amplify it. They're really leading the charge on a lot of core issues that we care about, and that we're engaged collaboratively on. And then the agencies, they do put out comment requests on a lot of various issues. And so I know we'll be filing another comment letter next week, or I'm not sure when this will air, but we'll have a comment letter coming on the Treasury Department's implementation of the Genius Act as it applies to stable coins and stablecoin issuers. And so we'll continue to keep the community updated on kind of what we're weighing in on and where we see the issues. And to the extent that the community wants to amplify those efforts, we are more than supportive of that.
Amazing. Yeah, please just share it on X. Like we're terminally online, so we'll just promote and amplify whatever you share. And we want to take part and we want to contribute where possible. So yeah, this has been amazing. Thank you so much, Brad. We've learned a lot. I think we'll probably chat again in a few months because things are heating up pretty quickly. But appreciate your time and appreciate the things you guys are doing for the Hyperliquid ecosystem.
Absolutely. So glad that I could join and kind of give more insight into what we're doing on Capitol Hill. And if you're building in the community and you haven't been in touch with us yet, please feel free to reach out on X. We're at Hyperliquid PC. You can probably find the rest of our accounts through there, and we're always happy to set up times to talk with whoever's building in the industry. So we would love to hear from you.
Cool. Thanks so much, and have a good one, Brad. Cheers.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.